The day Sadie Donnelly buried her husband, the word love died in her throat like a candle snuffed by a cold wind, and for 3 years she had not once let it rise again. The town of Calico Bend, Texas, sat at the edge of nowhere in particular, the kind of place the railroad had nearly reached in 1882 before the company decided that the land was not worth the iron and moved its ambitions 20 miles north. What remained was a scattering of clapboard buildings along a single red dirt road, a general store that smelled of leather and molasses, a livery stable that leaned slightly to the east, a church with a cracked bell, and about 200 souls who had all decided, for various private reasons, that this particular patch of scrub and dust was where they intended to make their stand against the world. Sadie had come to Calico Bend as a bride at 22, riding beside her husband James in a wagon loaded with everything they owned, which was not much. James Donnelly had been a good man, a genuine and uncomplicated goodness that expressed itself in practical ways. He fixed fence posts before they fell, he paid his debts on time, and he never once raised his voice at her in all 4 years of their marriage. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1880, 3 years before this story begins, leaving Sadie at 26 with a small cattle operation, 47 head of longhorn, a son named Eli who was 4 years old, a daughter named Clara who was 2, and a grief so total that it had reorganized her entire inner life around the single principle of survival. She was 29 now, in the spring of 1883. Her hair was dark brown with a single streak of silver near her left temple that had appeared the week after the funeral. She was not a large woman, but she had the posture of someone who had decided to take up exactly as much space as the world required of her, no more and no less. The neighbors said she was handsome. They also said she was cold, but they said it with a certain admiration, the way people in hard country speak of a river that has learned to run between its proper banks. The 47 head of cattle had dwindled to 31 by the second winter, and Sadie had taken to doing laundry for the men at the boarding house in town to supplement what little cash the cattle brought in. She had also taken in a hired hand, an old Mexican man named Señor Reyes who had worked the range since before Texas was a state, and who spoke very little English and required very little conversation, which suited Sadie perfectly. They understood each other in the language of hard work and mutual respect, and that was enough. But Señor Reyes had left in March, his joints finally surrendering to the cold and the labor, and his nephew in San Antonio was waiting for him. He left on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and his eyes wet, and Sadie had stood on the porch and watched him go with her arms crossed and her jaw set, because that was the only way she knew how to let things leave her anymore. She needed a new hand. She had posted a notice at the general store, written in her careful schoolteacher's script. She had been a schoolteacher before she was a wife, that she required a competent ranch hand for fair wages, room and board included, experience with cattle preferred. The notice had been up for 2 weeks when Tobias Langston rode into Calico Bend on a bay horse named Conductor. He came from the north, which people noticed, because most strangers came from the east or the west following the old trail roads. Coming from the north meant you had been somewhere specific and were now leaving it, which was a different kind of story than the ones Calico Bend was used to. He was 33 years old, lean in the way that men who work outdoors in all weather become lean, with dark eyes that were the color of good creek water and a jaw that had not seen a razor in about 4 days. He wore a brown canvas duster that had been mended at the left elbow, a hat that had once been black and was now more the color of old pewter, and the kind of expression that suggested he had seen enough of the world to be neither impressed nor frightened by most of what it offered. He stopped at the general store to buy supplies and read the posting board, as a man traveling through a strange town will do, partly from habit and partly from hope. He had been working ranches across the Panhandle for the past 7 years, since he left his family's modest farm in Kansas at 26 because the drought had taken everything his father had built and there was nothing left to inherit but debt and grief. He was good with cattle. He was good with horses. He knew how to fix things, which was perhaps the most useful quality a man could have in 1883 Texas, where things were constantly breaking. He read Sadie's notice twice. He spoke to Martin Webb, the store owner, who told him in the forthright way of small-town merchants that Mrs. Donnelly was a widow woman with 2 young children and a modest cattle operation, that she was honest and paid what she promised, and that she was, he said with a particular careful emphasis, a serious kind of woman. Tobias had looked at the notice again and said, "I'll ride out." He found the Donnelly place in the late afternoon, when the Texas light was going golden and long across the Mesquite Flats. It was a decent spread, small but properly tended, the kind of property that told you the person managing it was working harder than they perhaps had the capacity to sustain indefinitely. The fence posts were straight. The barn was patched but sound. The house was a simple structure of whitewashed boards with a porch that ran across the front, and there were 2 children sitting on that porch. A boy of about 6 who was concentrating fiercely on carving something out of a piece of stick with a small knife, and a small girl of about 4 who was watching him with the absolute focus of a younger sibling determined to copy everything. Sadie came around the side of the house wiping her hands on her apron when she heard conductors' hooves on the packed earth of the yard. She looked at Tobias with an assessing directness that he would later tell her had made him feel somewhat like a horse being considered for purchase. "You're here about the posting," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "Tobias Langston. I've been working cattle in the Panhandle. I've got references from the Harker Ranch near Amarillo and the Collins spread outside of Lubbock if you need them." She looked at his hands, which he would also later tell her was a thing he had noticed, the way she looked at his hands before his face, because hands told you whether a man actually worked or only claimed to. "Get down," she said, "and tell me what you know about longhorns." He got down. They talked for 40 minutes, standing in her yard in the long afternoon light, and by the end of it she had offered him the room in the barn, which was clean and dry and had a proper cot in it, not just a pile of hay, and a wage of $12 a month plus his meals, which she cooked for herself and the children every evening and would extend to him as part of the arrangement. "I don't require conversation at meals," she said. "I require that you come clean and that you don't frighten the children." "That suits me," he said. "Then you can start tomorrow." He slept that first night in the barn listening to the horses breathe and the coyotes carry on their distant philosophical arguments in the dark, and he thought that the woman had an interesting quality about her, a kind of sealed-off strength that made him curious in the way that a locked room makes you curious, not aggressively, not urgently, but persistently in the back of your mind, the way a question sits when you know the answer exists somewhere and is worth knowing. The first weeks established a rhythm. He was up before she was, which she noticed and approved of without saying so. By the time the children were awake and the kitchen fire was going, he had already done the first feeding and checked the water troughs, and was usually returning to the barn for whatever the day's main task was. Sadie would leave his breakfast on the back step. This was the arrangement in the beginning, before anything shifted, and she would take the children through their morning lessons at the kitchen table, because she was determined that Eli and Clara would be educated people, and then she would do the laundry and the household work and join him in whatever the afternoon required. He discovered quickly that she was not the kind of woman who watched from the porch. She worked alongside him. She knew how to handle cattle with a competence that had clearly been hard-won rather than inherited, and she made decisions on her property without hesitation. She never asked him what she should do. She sometimes asked him what he thought, and then she made her own decision, which was often the same as what he had thought and sometimes was better. He was careful. He understood without being told that there was a boundary in this arrangement that was about more than just the practical separation of the house from the barn. He did not push at it. He was courteous and direct, and he did what he said he would do. And after the first month she began leaving his breakfast on the kitchen table instead of the back step, which he understood to be a significant concession even if she made it appear casual. The children were another matter. Eli, at 6, was a solemn boy who held himself slightly apart from new people and watched them for a long time before committing any opinion. Clara, at 4, had no such reserve whatsoever, and had decided within approximately 48 hours of Tobias's arrival that he was someone she could talk to without limit. She would find him in the barn or the south pasture, and she would begin conversations in the middle of thoughts she had apparently been having privately for some time, with no introduction or context, as though he had been present for the whole interior monologue and was simply catching up. "Do you think horses dream?" she asked him one morning while he was oiling a saddle. "I think they probably do," he said, with the seriousness the question deserved. "What do you think they dream about?" "Running, probably. Grass. Maybe things they remember." Clara considered this with her chin in her hands. "I dream about Papa sometimes," she said. "He is always in the kitchen in my dreams." Tobias set down the oilcloth. "That sounds like a good kind of dream," he said carefully. "Mama doesn't talk about him," Clara said, not with accusation, simply as a statement of fact. "Sometimes it's hard to talk about people we miss," he said. "Do you miss anybody?" He thought about his father, who had died 2 winters ago, and about his mother, who was living with his sister in Kansas and whom he had not seen in a year. "Yes," he said. "I do." Clara nodded gravely, satisfied. "Me too," she said. And then she was up and running toward the house with the complete spontaneity of small children who exhaust a topic thoroughly, and then move on to the next thing without ceremony. Tobias went back to the saddle, but he sat with that conversation longer than he might have expected, turning it over in his mind the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it. And what he found underneath, it was the understanding that Sadie Donnelly was carrying something very heavy and had been carrying it alone for a long time, and that the weight of it had not diminished her, but it had made her into a kind of fortress, which was sometimes the same thing as a prison. Eli came around more slowly. It happened over the course of a fence-mending project in the east pasture that took most of a week in June, when the heat was considerable, and Tobias was working his way along a long stretch of downed wire that had been brought down by a fallen cedar tree. He had not asked for help, but one morning Eli appeared with a pair of leather gloves that were much too large for his hands and a solemn expression that suggested he had made a decision. "I can help," Eli said. "I'd be grateful," Tobias said. "You know how to hold wire. Papa showed me. Show me what he showed you and we'll work together." They worked together for 6 days. By the end of it, Eli had begun initiating conversation, which Tobias knew was a great gift from a boy like that, and the conversations were about serious matters: the proper depth of a post hole, the difference between cedar and mesquite for fence posts, which horses were good-natured and which were not. Tobias answered all of it with the same steady respect he would have given a man, because he could see that was what Eli needed, to be taken seriously in the absence of a father, to have his questions received as worthy of real answers. When the fence was finished, Eli came and stood beside him and looked at the straight new line of it running across the pasture and said, with a child's uncomplicated satisfaction, "That's good work." "It is," Tobias agreed. "You put in good work this week." Eli considered that. "Mr. Langston," he said. "Yes. My papa was a good man." Tobias looked at the boy's profile, the serious set of his jaw that was his mother's jaw, the way he held himself very straight. "I believe that," he said. "A man who raised a son like you had to have been." Eli did not respond to this. He nodded once, very slightly, and walked back toward the house, and Tobias understood that something important had just occurred, though neither of them would have been able to describe it precisely. He mentioned none of this to Sadie. He did not report on his conversations with her children as though they were subjects to be assessed. But something in her manner shifted in the days after the fence project, a small but perceptible loosening, like the first sign of a winter-stiff hinge beginning to work properly again. She had begun coming to the barn door in the evenings, ostensibly to check on the horses or to bring some item she needed. But she would pause for a few minutes in the way that people pause when they have been alone with their thoughts all day, and find the company of another person unexpectedly desirable, even if the company involves very little speech. Tobias learned to read these pauses and to offer her the right kind of quiet, the kind that does not press or ask anything, the kind that simply opens a space and lets the other person choose whether to enter it. One evening in early July, she paused in the barn doorway and said, somewhat abruptly, "You're good with them." He looked up from the horse's hoof he was examining. "They're good children," he said. "It's not difficult. Clara talks to you like she's known you for years." "Clara talks to everyone like she's known them for years," he said, and Sadie made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to the shape of one, and for a moment her face held something unguarded, something younger than her usual expression, and then it was gone. "She does," Sadie said. "She gets that from she's always been that way." The sentence had started in one direction and then redirected itself, and they both knew what the original direction had been, and Sadie left shortly after that without completing whatever thought had been beginning, and Tobias went back to checking the horse's hoof with the careful attention of a man who is trying not to make another person feel watched. Supper at the Donnelly house was a particular kind of institution. Sadie was a good cook, not elaborate, not fancy, but the food was always solid and well-seasoned, the kind of cooking that comes from genuine care rather than performance. They ate at the kitchen table, Sadie and the children and now Tobias, and the meals were punctuated by the children's conversation and requests and small dramas, which provided enough noise and motion to make the fact that the adults rarely addressed each other directly somewhat less visible than it might otherwise have been. But July deepened into August, and August in Texas is a particular kind of furnace that burns away pretense along with everything else, and the evenings brought all four of them to the table in the close warmth of the kitchen, with an intimacy that the weather imposed regardless of what anyone intended, and Tobias began to notice things that he had been carefully not noticing. The way Sadie's hands moved when she served the food, quick and economical and exact. The way she listened to her children, truly listened, giving each statement its full weight before responding. The way she laughed when Clara said something absurd. She didn't laugh often, but when she did it was a real laugh, starting in her chest, unstoppable, and it transformed her face completely. The small line between her brows that appeared when she was worried about something, which was often. The particular quality of her silence, which was different from emptiness. It was the silence of a person with a great deal of thought moving behind it. He was careful. He was patient. He had not come here looking for anything except work, and he told himself this with increasing frequency through the months of summer, which was itself a sign that the argument was becoming less persuasive. There was a day in September when a late-season storm came through from the southwest, and the cattle spooked and broke the south fence in 3 places and got into the Harrington land, and Sadie and Tobias spent 8 hours in the rain driving them back and repairing the fence by lantern light while the children slept. They worked without talking much because they did not need to talk. They had by now developed the understanding of 2 people who have worked alongside each other long enough to know each other's movements and intentions. At one point she slipped in the mud near the fence line and he caught her arm and she steadied herself and said, "Thank you," and he said, "Of course," and they worked on, and neither of them acknowledged that his hand had been slow to leave her elbow or that the brief contact had left a warmth in it that the rain could not quite extinguish. They got the cattle back. They repaired the fence. They arrived back at the house somewhere past midnight, soaking and exhausted, and she made coffee because they were too tired and too cold to simply go to sleep. And they sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a house where the children were asleep, and the storm was moving east, and they drank the coffee and said very little. But what was said between them was the particular kind of nothing that is actually something, the kind of quiet that exists between 2 people who are slowly, carefully, against their better judgment, beginning to matter to each other. He went to his room in the barn that night and lay on the cot in the sound of the departing rain, and thought about what he was doing, which was becoming something he had not planned to become, which was attached. He thought about the fact that she was a widow who had not fully turned back toward the living world yet, and that he was a hired hand who was in no position to complicate the life of a woman with 2 children and a struggling cattle operation, and that the sensible thing was to hold his current course of careful distance and useful work, and not let any of this run further than it had already run. He thought all of this very seriously. And then he thought about the moment when her laugh had caught her off guard at supper last week, when Clara had put a biscuit on her head and announced she was a queen, and he found that he could not think about it without something in his chest doing an inconvenient thing, and he gave up on sensible arguments for the night and went to sleep. The first time he saw her cry was in October. He had come back from moving the cattle to the north pasture earlier than expected, and had come around the side of the house to find her sitting on the back porch steps with a letter in her hands and her face in a state that he had never seen it in before, open and undefended in the way that faces get when they don't know anyone is watching. She was not crying loudly or dramatically. It was just tears moving quietly down her face while she looked at nothing, and she held the letter with both hands in her lap. He should have retreated. He knew that. But she had heard him because she was a woman who noticed everything, and she looked up before he could step back. And there was a moment where her face did the quick reassembly that he knew well from watching her manage her grief in front of the children. And then she must have decided that the reassembly was not worth the energy today, because she let it go and she said, "His mother. She passed last month. This is the letter from his brother." He understood immediately who she meant by his. He sat down on the step below her, not beside her, at a respectful angle that gave her the sense of not being crowded while not leaving her alone. "I'm sorry," he said. "She was kind to me," Sadie said. "James's mother. She came and stayed with the children for 2 weeks after the funeral. I never properly thanked her, and now I can't." "She knew," he said. "Women like that who come and stay and do what needs doing, they don't do it for the thanks." Sadie looked at him. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "My mother," he said. "She's that kind of woman. When my father died, she had the neighbors' meals organized before she had her own affairs settled." She was quiet for a moment. "Where is your mother now?" "Kansas, with my sister. I'm going to get back there to visit before winter. I've been meaning to." "You should go," she said, and something in her voice was very direct, very genuine. "You should not leave things unsaid to the people who matter. I know that now." The weight of what she had not quite said, the sentence that had almost contained the word love and then been redirected, sat between them for a moment. "No," he agreed quietly. "You shouldn't." She folded the letter with the careful precision of a woman restoring order to things. "I apologize," she said. "This is not, you don't need to hear this." "I don't mind hearing it," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and something softer, and then she said, "Go see to the horses. I'll have supper in an hour." He went to see to the horses. But he was aware, as he brushed down conductor in the quiet of the barn, of a new quality in the air between them, a kind of acknowledged tenderness that had not been there before, that had arrived through the particular door of shared honesty that the letter had opened, and which was now going to be very difficult to close. He took 3 days in November to ride up to Kansas and see his mother, and he wrote to her before he left so she would know he was coming. And when he arrived, she was on the porch of his sister's house, waiting for him with the particular erect patience of mothers who have been waiting for their children since the beginning of time. He held her for a longer time than usual, and she said nothing about it except to pat his back with both hands, which was her complete vocabulary of comfort and had always been enough. She asked him about his work. He told her about the Donnelly place. He told her about the cattle and the fence and the children and the repairs he had done to the barn roof. His mother listened to all of this with the experienced attention of a woman who has been listening to men talk around their actual subject for 50 years. "This widow," his mother said when he was done. "Her name is Sadie," he said. "Is she a good woman?" He looked out at his sister's yard, at the stark November trees. "Yes," he said. "She's about the most capable person I've ever met. She's been through something real, and she came out the other side still standing." His mother was quiet for a moment. "Tobias," she said, "yes, don't be foolish about this." "I'm not being foolish about anything. I mean, don't be a fool about it in the wrong direction," his mother said with some precision. "Not the reckless kind, the cautious kind, the kind where you're so afraid of misstepping that you do nothing and she goes on thinking she has to manage everything alone when you are right there." He looked at her. "Your father was like that," she said. "He needed persuading that he was permitted to want things." He rode back to Calico Bend 5 days later, and the Texas sky on that return ride was vast and blue and achingly clear, and he thought about what his mother had said the whole way. When he came back, Sadie was on the porch with the children, and Clara saw him first and came running down the yard to meet him, calling, "Mr. Langston, Mr. Langston." And he caught her up without thinking, and she sat on Conductor's neck in front of the saddle with enormous satisfaction. And when he reached the porch, Sadie was looking at him with the expression she reserved for things that caught her off guard, not quite smiling. But her face was open in a way that made something in his chest press warmly against his ribs. "Good trip," she said. "Good trip," he said. "Mother sends her regards. I told her about the place and the children." Sadie looked slightly startled that she had been the subject of conversation in Kansas, and then she said, "Give her my thanks for lending you to us." He thought about that phrasing, "lending you to us," for a long time after, and whether the us was the place or the children or something larger, and he decided he was probably reading more into it than was there, and then he decided he probably was not. December brought the hard cold of a Texas winter, not as brutal as Kansas but cold enough to be taken seriously, and the cattle needed extra management, and there were 2 days in the middle of the month when a norther came through, and the temperature dropped enough to be dangerous. Sadie moved the children to sleep near the kitchen stove, and she sent word to Tobias through the kitchen door that he was welcome to sleep in the house during the worst of the freeze rather than in the barn. And he came in and slept on the floor near the stove with his blanket and his coat, and woke up to find Clara sleeping approximately 18 inches from his face, having migrated in the night from her proper spot. Sadie stood in the kitchen doorway in the gray morning light looking at this arrangement with an expression he could not quite read, and then she went to start the coffee, and he carefully moved Clara back to her bedding without waking her and went about his morning. That was the day something changed in the quality of the tension between them, shifted from the kind that comes from restraint to the kind that comes from approaching inevitability, the way the air changes before weather. He waited. He was patient. He had promised himself patience. Christmas came and Sadie made a small celebration of it for the children, and he contributed a carved wooden horse he had been working on for Eli, and a doll made from scraps of cloth that Senora Reyes, the old man's daughter who lived in town, had helped him make for Clara. And when the children opened these gifts, Sadie looked at him across the table with an expression that lasted only a moment before she moved her eyes away. But in that moment, it was perfectly clear and unambiguous. And he had to find something to look at on the far wall with some urgency. The new year came in 1884. In February, there was a social gathering at the church. Not quite a dance. The church elder disapproved of dancing, but a community supper with music in the form of a fiddle, and a guitar played by 2 brothers named Calhoun who managed to sound festive enough that several couples moved their feet in ways that could not technically be called dancing, but left very little room for doubt. It was the first social event of any kind that Sadie had attended since she could remember, and she went because Eli had been asked to participate in a brief recitation. The schoolteacher was organizing for the younger children, and he had practiced his verses so earnestly that there was no possibility of staying home. She wore a dress that was the color of deep green, the good dress she kept for occasions, and she had done something with her hair that was different from its usual practical arrangement. And when Tobias offered her his arm to walk from the wagon to the church door, he did it because it was the natural thing to do on a dark February night on uneven ground, and because it was the natural thing she accepted it, and they walked into the church together with the children ahead of them. And the town of Calico Bend made note of this in the communal way that small towns make note of things, quietly and comprehensively. Eli recited his verses with great seriousness, and only one small hesitation in the middle of the second stanza, and Clara clapped for him with a vigor that was somewhat disruptive. Sadie sat straight-backed beside Tobias in the church pew, and her hands were folded in her lap with the same careful restraint that characterized all of her movements in public. But at one point during the music portion of the evening, the Calhoun brothers launched into a particularly lively piece, and Clara, who was sitting on Sadie's other side, grabbed both of their hands at the same time and began swinging them in enthusiastic rhythm. And so for approximately 30 seconds Tobias Langston was holding Sadie Donnelly's hand through the medium of a 4-year-old who saw nothing unusual about this arrangement whatsoever. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. Clara swung their hands until the song ended and then released them both and resumed swinging her own feet, and the moment ended, but not really. Walking back to the wagon afterward, she took his arm again, and this time there was nothing in particular to necessitate it except that she did. They did not speak on the drive home. The children fell asleep leaning against each other in the back of the wagon. The night was cold and clear, and the stars in a Texas sky in February are astonishing, a density of light that makes the darkness around them seem less like darkness and more like the spaces between rooms in a very large house. At some point she said into the quiet, "You could have gone to the dance that the Harrington boys were talking about. In town, you didn't have to come tonight." "I know," he said. "It would have been there are younger women in town who would have been glad of the company." "I'm sure," he said. There was a pause. "Tobias," she said, and his name in her mouth was different from its usual usage, less a way of getting his attention and more a kind of acknowledgement, as though she were saying the name because she meant it. "Sadie," he said. She looked straight ahead at the horses. "I don't know how to do this," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very even, the voice she used when she was containing something rather than expressing it. "I don't know if I don't know what I am anymore or what I'm permitted to." She stopped. "That sounds like self-pity and it isn't. I just mean." "I know what you mean," he said. "Do you? You mean you've been so long being only what the situation required that you can't quite remember how to be anything else. And you're not sure that anything else is allowed." The silence stretched for a moment, and then she said very quietly, "Yes, it's allowed," he said. She did not respond to this immediately, and he did not push it, and they rode the rest of the way home in the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but fullness, the way a cup that is filled to the rim holds its contents very still to keep from spilling. March arrived with warm rain and the smell of the land opening again after winter, and the cattle were doing better than they had the previous year, because Tobias had implemented a rotation on the pastures that was distributing the grazing more evenly, and there was real hope that the spring calves would bring a strong enough count to make the operation genuinely viable. Sadie had noticed the improvement, and she had mentioned it to him one afternoon with the particular directness she used when acknowledging something that mattered to her. "The north pasture," she said, "the grass is already coming back thicker than I've seen it. It needed rest," he said. "The cattle were working it too hard." "How did you know to do that?" "Something an old rancher in the Panhandle showed me once. He said the land is like everything else. It needs to be given something back or it stops being able to give." She had looked at him for a moment in a way that suggested he had said something that was about more than grass, and then she had gone back to what she was doing, and he had allowed this in the way that he allowed most things with her, with patience, with the understanding that the ground between them was being worked carefully, and that forcing things would damage what was already growing. April was when the Harrington man came to call. His name was Douglas Harrington, the eldest son of the family whose land bordered Sadie's to the east, a broad, capable man of about 40 with a face like a sun-weathered door, and the manner of someone who had always gotten what he wanted through the simple application of persistence. He had been widowed himself 2 years earlier, and was known to have been considering remarriage for some time. He had been to Sadie's property twice before in contexts that could be explained as neighborly, but this April visit was more direct. He came on a Thursday afternoon when Tobias was working in the south pasture and Sadie was hanging laundry. He sat in the yard on his horse and said what he had come to say, which was that he was a practical man and she was a practical woman, and that the two properties joining would make something genuinely solid, and that he would be good to the children, who needed a father. Tobias heard none of this directly. He heard the account of it later from Sadie, who told him that evening at supper after the children were in bed. She told him with a dry precision that stripped the romance, such as it was, entirely out of it. He presented it as a business arrangement, she said. To his credit, he didn't pretend otherwise. He said he needed a capable woman and I needed a man on the property. Tobias set down his coffee cup very carefully. What did you tell him? I told him I would consider it, she said, because I'm a practical woman and I'm not going to dismiss a practical offer out of emotion. He looked at the table. Does that upset you? She said, and her voice was different, less even than usual, with an edge in it that was not quite challenge and not quite hope. He looked up at her. Yes, he said, and the word was simply true without decoration. Sadie sat with that for a moment. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, a look in which the usual careful management of her features had been entirely suspended. Tell me why, she said. Because you deserve better than a business arrangement, he said. And because, Sadie, I have been trying very hard not to complicate things here, not to step past what my position allows. But if you are genuinely considering it, then I need you to know that I don't, she said, and it was sharp and he stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Don't say it quickly, she said. Don't say it because you're frightened of losing something to Harrington. If it's real, then it will keep until you're sure. He held very still. You're right, he said. I know I'm right, she said. And I'm not going to accept Douglas Harrington's offer, but not because of you, because of me. Because I have been a business arrangement once before and it was not my marriage, it was other people's idea of what a woman should do, and I am not going to do it again. You loved James, he said quietly. That wasn't a business arrangement. Her face shifted. No, she said very softly. No, it wasn't. I loved James very much. She paused. I haven't said that out loud since the burial, that word. He understood what she meant. He did not say anything. He let her have the space the statement needed. She stood up and began clearing the supper plates with the efficiency she always brought to tasks that she needed to do with her hands, and he let her. And that night was the first night that the territory between them had been mapped, however roughly, and both of them knew it. Harrington came back twice more in April. She declined him both times, more directly each time, until the final time she was quite plain about it, and he rode away with a dignity that Sadie said afterward she respected even if the enterprise had been misguided. And that was the end of Harrington, and the spring moved into May with the particular sweetness of the Texas hill country coming alive after winter and rain. It was a May evening when the thing that has been building in this story since its beginning finally arrived, as things that have been building will eventually do, whether or not you are ready for them. Sadie had made a supper of roasted chicken, which she reserved for evenings when she felt the household had earned something more than the everyday, and there were biscuits and the first green beans of the season from the kitchen garden, and apple preserves she had put up the previous autumn. The kitchen was warm with the cooking, and the western light was still coming through the window in long amber bars. Clara had been full of conversation about a rabbit she had seen near the garden fence, And Eli had been quiet in the focused way he got when he was thinking something through. The children ate, and then Sadie sent them to wash up and prepare for bed, and she and Tobias remained at the table with the remains of the supper between them and the long evening light moving across the room. And in that particular quality of quiet, the house stilled by the departure of the children's noise, the day settling into itself. Sadie was watching the window, and he was watching the last of his coffee, and she said, with complete inadvertence, as though the words had arrived without being summoned, as though the defenses that had been keeping them out for 3 years had simply and finally come down. "I love this time of evening." The air in the kitchen changed so slightly that a stranger would not have noticed it. He noticed it. He noticed it because he had come to know the particular texture of her silences and her speech, and the difference between what she said and what she meant. And he understood in the fraction of a second after those words that she had heard them too, heard the word that had slipped out of her mouth without her permission, heard it with the full weight of everything she had kept it locked away from for 3 years. He felt her stillness beside him like a held breath. He looked at his coffee. He turned the cup slightly on the table. He did not react. He did not show any sign that anything unusual had occurred, because he understood immediately, and with a certainty that was perhaps the clearest thing he had felt in years, that if she thought he had noticed the word, she would retreat from it and from him, and from whatever had begun opening between them, with all the disciplined precision of a woman who had been managing her interior life as a fortress for 3 years. She would take it back. She would barricade herself behind it. And he did not want her to take it back. He wanted her to be able to say it again, and to say it on purpose, and he understood that the only way she would be able to do that was if this moment did not become a moment. "The light does something to the land," he said, as though the conversation had simply continued from wherever it had been. "I noticed it this afternoon coming back from the north pasture. That hour before the sun goes down, everything looks, I don't know, like it means to be here." He felt her breathe. A pause. The length of several heartbeats. "Yes," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very deliberate. "Yes, that is exactly it." Another pause, shorter. It is the thing I love most about this place, if I am honest." He kept his eyes on the window, on the light. She had said it again, not by accident this time. Twice now, the word that had not left her in 3 years. He looked at her. She was looking at him with an expression that was the most open he had ever seen it, a face without its walls, a face that was simply her, tired and brave and very present, and her eyes held both the residue of grief and something that was very much its opposite, something that was forward-facing and alive, and he understood that this was not a moment to wait any more. "Sadie," he said. "I know," she said, and she said it with the same directness she brought to everything, to decisions and assessments and the hard truths of managing a difficult life, and this was her bringing that same directness to something much harder and more essential. "I need you to know," he said, "that I have been, since somewhere around July, if I'm being honest, maybe earlier, I have been doing something with my better judgment that it doesn't appreciate, which is ignoring it." The corner of her mouth moved. "I noticed," she said. "You noticed." "Tobias," she said, and there was gentle amusement in it. "I notice everything." He laughed, and it was a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she laughed too, and the laughter broke something that had been holding its shape very carefully for a long time and let it settle into something more natural, and the evening light was moving golden through the kitchen, and neither of them moved for a moment, just let the laughter settle. Then he said, more quietly, "I don't want to rush anything. I know what you've been through. I know that I know how much James meant to you, and I would never try to. You are not replacing anyone," she said, and there was a firmness in it, a clarity. "I know the difference. I know what this is." She paused. "What is this, Tobias? Tell me honestly." He held her gaze steadily. "I think I love you," he said. "I think I have for a while now. I don't say it to put any pressure on you or to hurry anything. I say it because you asked for honesty and you deserve it." She was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were on the table, and he put his hand over hers carefully, without demand, just the fact of it. I'm afraid, she said. I know. The last time I let myself, the last time I felt this way, and then she stopped. I'm afraid of it ending. I'm afraid of loving someone and having them. I'm afraid of what happens to those children if they love you and then you're gone. I'm not going anywhere, he said. You can't promise that. No, he said honestly. I can't promise what happens. I can promise what I intend, and I can tell you that what I intend is to stay, to build something here with you if you'll let me, not just as a hand, as whatever you'll allow me to be. She turned her hand over under his and held it. Give me some time, she said. Not to decide whether I think I've already decided that, but to get used to the deciding, to stop being afraid of it. I have all the time in the world, he said. She looked at him very steadily. I'm going to hold you to that, she said. I expect you to, he said. The spring moved into a summer that was different from the previous year's summer in ways that were specific and particular. They were not changed in the outward form of their days, the work and the meals and the children's rhythms, but something in the quality of it was entirely altered. The way the same landscape looks different when the light changes, same forms, different meaning. He brought her wildflowers once, which he had not done before, setting them in a tin cup on the porch without ceremony or explanation, and she had found them in the morning and brought them inside and put them on the kitchen table, and said nothing about them except to look at him once with an expression that said everything that needed to be said. He fixed the cracked step on the porch that had needed fixing for months, not because she asked him to, but because it was there, and because the act of tending to the things around her was the vocabulary he had available for what he felt. She began bringing his coffee to him in the mornings when he was in the barn, which was a small reversal of the usual arrangement, and which meant something accordingly. There were evenings when they sat on the porch after the children were in bed, the two of them in the warm Texas dark with the sound of the crickets and the distant cattle and the cooling sky overhead, and they talked in a way that went far past the daily logistics of the ranch, talked about their histories, their losses, the shape of what they wanted their lives to be. She told him about her own parents, who had both died of cholera when she was 15, and how she had been raised by her aunt in Tennessee, a woman who was capable and cold, and who had taught her by negative example that self-sufficiency was necessary but not sufficient, that a person could be completely capable and completely alone at the same time, and that this was not the same as being strong. He told her about his father's farm and the years of drought that had taken it, and about the shame his father had carried, a good man ground down by circumstances that had nothing to do with his merit, and how that had taught Tobias that worth was not the same as outcome, that the world was indifferent to the quality of your character in ways that had to be simply accepted and worked around, and that the only thing worth measuring yourself against was whether you were doing your genuine best with what you had. She listened to all of this with the quality of attention she gave to everything, thorough and present, and she said at one point, "You think about things carefully." "I grew up in a lot of quiet," he said. "You do." "I used to think more," she said. "Before, I used to have a kind of inner life ideas, things I wanted to understand. After James died, I closed all of that off. I couldn't afford it, I just needed to survive." "You can have it back," he said. "You don't have to just survive anymore." She looked at the dark yard. "I don't know how to allow myself to want things, big things. Not just the day's requirements." "What do you want?" he said. "If you let yourself want something." She was quiet for a long time. The crickets went on, steadfast. Somewhere a horse shifted in the barn. "I want to stop being afraid," she said at last. "I want Eli to have a real education, more than I can give him here. I want Clara to grow up in a house where she knows I want her to know what love looks like so she knows it when she sees it. I want the cattle to do well enough that I never have to worry about losing this land." A pause. "And I have been sitting on this porch in the evenings more since you have been here, and I would like to keep doing that." "That last one is easily arranged," he said. She made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time, definite and unambiguous. "Tobias Langston," she said. Sadie Donnelly, he said. She turned to look at him in the dark, and then she did something she had not done since she could not remember, since before the grief and the survival and the long frozen years of managing everything alone. She leaned over and kissed him, not tentatively, with the same directness she brought to every decision she made. And he kissed her back with the patience and the care of a man who has been waiting for something he had come to believe was worth waiting for. And the Texas night went on around them in the dark, as it had been doing since long before either of them arrived and would continue doing long after. Vast and continuous and entirely indifferent to the specific miracle of two people finding their way to each other on a small porch at the edge of the land. When they drew back, she looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen before, which was simply happiness, uncomplicated and present, and it transformed her face into something that was already beautiful into something almost unbearably so. "I'm still afraid," she said. "I know," he said. "But I'm going to do it anyway," she said. "I know that too," he said. They sat together on the porch for another hour, not saying much, the particular quiet of two people who have crossed a threshold and are simply resting in the new room for a moment before beginning the work of it. The rest of that summer and into the fall was a time that Sadie would later describe, privately, in the interior language she had not been able to access for years, as a return to herself. It was not that everything became easy. The cattle operation had difficult weeks. There was a bad month in August when 3 calves were lost to a sickness that spread through the herd before Tobias caught it, and the financial pressure was real and the worry was real, and she worked as hard as she had always worked. But the working was different now. It was not only survival, it was building. He asked her to marry him in September, standing in the south pasture in the early morning light, with no particular ceremony except that he had taken his hat off and he was looking at her with everything he felt plainly visible in his face, which was the most honest she had ever seen a person's face. "I'm not a rich man," he said. "I don't have property or much to my name besides what I earn. I know this is not what, Tobias," she said. "Yes. I'm not marrying for property," she said. "I have property. What I've been without for 3 years is yes." She paused. "Yes," she said again, more simply, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of eloquence. He put his hat back on and looked at her, and then he crossed the distance between them and held her in the south pasture in the morning light, and the cattle went on grazing around them with the complete philosophical indifference of cattle, and she held on to him with both hands and thought, for the first time in 3 years, that the future was not something to be endured but something to be wanted. They told the children that evening. Eli received this information with his customary solemnity. He looked at Tobias for a long moment and then he looked at his mother and then he said, "Is this what you want, Mama?" "Yes," Sadie said, "very much." Eli looked at Tobias again. "You'll stay?" He said, and the weight behind the question was everything, the leaving, the loss, the particular terror of a boy who has already lost one person he thought was permanent. "I'll stay," Tobias said. "I give you my word." Eli held out his hand with the grave formality of a child who has learned that some things require ceremony. Tobias shook it, solemnly, with full respect for the significance of it. Clara, for her part, burst into delighted tears, which startled everyone including herself, and then began talking at high speed about whether they could get another dog, which the family did not currently have, and whether she could be a flower girl, and whether Mr. Langston, could she call him something else now, and whether they could have cake at the wedding, all of this in approximately 45 seconds, and Sadie and Tobias looked at each other over Clara's head and both of them were laughing, and the kitchen was full of noise and warmth and the particular quality of joy that arrives after a long absence and is therefore known to be precious. The wedding was in November, on a clear cold day with the blue sky of Texas autumn, vaulted above the small white church of Calico Bend. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with the plain dignity he brought to all things. Half the town attended, because Calico Bend was the kind of town where a wedding was a community event, and also because most of them had been watching Tobias Langston and Sadie Donnelly arrange themselves toward each other for almost a year with the kind of patient interest small towns take in the romantic affairs of their members. Sadie wore the green dress, the good one, and she had done her hair in a way that was different from any of its previous arrangements, looser, more deliberate. She carried a small bunch of late-season flowers from the kitchen garden, yellow and white. She walked down the aisle with Eli on one side of her and Clara on the other, because she had no one else to walk with her, and because there was no one she would rather have had there. When they reached the front of the church and she turned to face Tobias, she saw his expression, and it was the expression of a man who is looking at something he had hoped for, and then given up hoping for, and then been given anyway. An expression of such unguarded feeling that she felt her composure do something complicated in her chest, and had to draw a slow breath to steady it. They said their vows in the plain language of the period, the words that had been said by so many people before them and would be said by many more after. And when they arrived at the portion where she was asked to say that she would love and honor him, she said it with a clarity and a steadiness that made the word ring through the small church like the note of that cracked bell from the steeple, clear and real, and without reservation. She said the word love, and she meant it in every direction, forward and present and without apology, and she felt as she said it something that had been held closed for a very long time open completely, like a door swung wide into bright air. The celebration after was at the Donnelly ranch, her ranch, their ranch, with food contributed by half the women in town, and the Calhoun brothers played their fiddle and guitar. And this time there was no ambiguity about the dancing, and Sadie danced with Tobias in the yard under the cold November stars while the fire burned in the pit, and the children ran in circles with the other children, and Martin Webb from the store raised a glass and said something gracious about new beginnings. At one point during the evening, Tobias found her standing slightly apart from the gathering, looking out at the dark pasture beyond the firelight, and he came and stood beside her, and she leaned against him without ceremony, the way you lean against something that has become familiar and solid. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking that I have been so afraid of this for so long," she said, "and it is nothing like what I was afraid of." "What were you afraid of?" "I was afraid that loving someone again would mean that it would diminish what was before it. James, that it would be a kind of betrayal or a kind of erasure." She paused. "It doesn't feel like that." "It shouldn't," he said. "You don't have to trade one thing for another." "I know that now," she said. "I think I always knew it, but I needed to see it in practice." She turned to look at him. "Tobias, I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "I love you," she said, not by accident, not redirected, not carved carefully around the word to avoid touching it. Directly and plainly, and with the full force of someone who has been saving a word for a long time and is now using it on the exact right thing. "I love you. I have for a while, and I was too frightened to say it until now, but I will not be frightened of it any more. I love you and this place and those children and this whole difficult, beautiful, exhausting life, and I am grateful for every piece of it." He held her face in his hands carefully, as though she were something that was both strong and precious, which she was. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since about July, when you climbed that fence in the rain to check on the cattle before you even looked to see if you were hurt, and I thought that you were the most remarkable person I had ever seen." She laughed, which was becoming the sound he associated most with the feeling of happiness. "That is a very specific moment," she said. "I have thought about it a great deal," he said. She kissed him, there in the dark edge of the firelight, with the party going on behind them and the stars very bright above, and the land was quiet around them, the land she had held on to through the worst years, and it felt tonight the way it was supposed to feel, like something built and tended and worth every ounce of what it had cost. The first year of their marriage was full. Tobias formally became a partner in the cattle operation rather than a hired hand, which was both a practical and symbolic shift, and the two of them ran it together, making decisions jointly, sometimes agreeing immediately and sometimes working through disagreement with the honest directness they both brought to things, and the operation began genuinely improving. By the spring of 1885, the herd was up to 53 head, the strongest count the Donnelly land had seen, and they were talking about the possibility of a modest expansion. Eli turned 8 in the spring of 1885 and had developed into a boy of very serious intellectual ambitions. He had read everything in the small collection of books the household contained and was agitating for more, and Sadie began ordering books through the general store when they could afford it, and she resumed the teaching she had done in their early years, more systematically, with the genuine intention that Eli would have the education she had always wanted for him. Tobias participated in this in his own way, teaching the boy the mathematics of the range, the practical kind that involved calculating head counts and land area and water requirements and profit margins, and Eli absorbed all of it with the focused intensity he brought to anything he cared about. Clara was 5 and was the emotional opposite of her brother, warm, loud, physically fearless, deeply opinionated about most things, and entirely unconcerned with being right so long as she was engaged. She had attached herself to Tobias with the absolute commitment she had shown from the beginning, and she called him Papa now, which had happened so gradually and naturally that no one could identify the exact moment it became his name in her vocabulary. She simply said it one day and kept saying it, and Tobias received it with the quiet gravity of someone who understood what it meant to be given that word. Eli took longer. He continued to call him Mr. Langston through the wedding and into the new year, and Sadie did not press it, understanding that Eli was working something out in his own time. It was the following April, a year and a half after the wedding, when Tobias was helping him with a difficult arithmetic problem at the kitchen table, and Eli said, without looking up from the paper, "Papa, I think I see where I went wrong," and then looked up and met Tobias's eyes and held them very steadily, offering the word the way he had offered his hand at the announcement of the engagement, with full ceremony and full meaning. "Where did you go wrong?" Tobias said, equally steady. "Right here," Eli said, pointing to the problem, and they went back to the arithmetic, and the word lay between them settled and permanent like a well-set fence post. In the late summer of 1885, Sadie told Tobias one evening on the porch that she was expecting. She told him in the direct way she told him everything, looking at him straight, and his response was to become very still for a moment, and then to pull her close with a gentleness and a fullness of feeling that she had come to know as his particular expression of joy, which was not loud but was complete. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "The children, both of them, came fine." "But you're always a little frightened." "We'll be all right," he said. "I know," she said. "I do know that." The pregnancy was healthy. She was 31 and strong, and Tobias was attentive without being overbearing, which was the correct calibration that she required, and the children were interested and excited, and Clara had very detailed opinions about names, none of which were under consideration. The baby came in April of 1886, on a rainy morning that was warm and smelled of the land coming alive again, which seemed appropriate. It was a boy, and he was healthy, and they named him Samuel James Langston, the middle name deliberate and acknowledged between them as the acknowledgement it was, a continuity, a honoring, because Sadie understood that love was not a finite thing that had to be divided and diminished by addition, but a thing that expanded, and Tobias understood this too. Eli, at 9 years old, held his new half-brother with an expression of absolute concentrated seriousness. As though he were taking on a responsibility he intended to discharge properly. Clara, at 7, held Samuel with rather more enthusiasm than was strictly advisable, and had to be reminded twice to support his head, which she did with great care and a running commentary about how small he was and how he smelled like bread. Tobias sat beside Sadie on the bed in the aftermath of the birth, when the midwife had gone and the children had been sent to the kitchen, and the house was quiet with the particular exhausted peace that follows the arrival of new life, and she was holding Samuel, and the lamp was burning low and warm, and he thought he had never seen anything that moved him quite as much as this specific arrangement of people in this specific room at this specific moment. "You are remarkable," he said. She looked up from the baby with a slightly incredulous expression. "I am very tired and not particularly presentable," she said. "Both of those things can be true," he said. She smiled, and it was the full smile, the real one that started in her chest and changed her whole face. "Samuel James," she said quietly, looking down at the baby. "He has your nose." "Poor child," Tobias said. "I like your nose," she said, "for the record." "I'll pass that along to Samuel," he said. "He'll be reassured." She laughed, and even exhausted, even raw and spent from labor, the laugh was the laugh he loved. And he sat beside her while the Texas spring rain came down outside and thought about how a life could be, if you let it, the kind that builds toward something instead of only enduring, and how that particular building was its own kind of love, patient and cumulative and better the more you added to it. The years that followed were not perfect years. No years are perfect. There were droughts that tested the cattle operation, and seasons when the money was very tight. There were the ordinary difficulties of raising children in hard country, in an era when medicine was limited, and the land was demanding. There was a summer in 1888 when Tobias was thrown from a horse and broke his arm badly, and spent 6 weeks unable to do the heavy work. And Sadie ran the operation alone during that time with the same iron competence she had always possessed, though now with the additional component of visible worry for him specifically, which she expressed in her way, not with declarations but with action, with the perfect cup of coffee timed to when he needed it, with the way she checked his arm each morning and held it gently in her hands to gauge his recovery. Calico Bend changed in those years too. The railroad finally arrived in 1887, which changed the economics of the region and brought new people and new pressures. Some of the older families sold their land and moved on. New businesses appeared. The town grew in ways that were sometimes disorienting and sometimes genuinely good. Tobias had seen the injustice of the land situation for the Mexican families in the region, the way the legal system was organized against them in ways that were plainly wrong. He had known it when he first arrived, and in the years after the railroad brought lawyers and land speculators, he saw several families displaced through practices that were technically legal and entirely unfair. He did what he could in the form of practical help, vouching for neighbors he knew to be honest, helping with legal documentation that some families could not afford to have drawn up, and generally being someone who said clearly what he saw when others preferred not to. Sadie was with him in this entirely. Her schoolteacher's sense of fairness was absolute, and she had a particular friendship with the family of Senor Reyes's nephew, who had come to Calico Bend for work after the old man's death, and she made sure that friendship was known and public rather than private and deniable, which mattered in a small town in Texas in 1887. Eli went to study at the school in the larger town of Manzana Creek when he was 15, the first step in the education that Sadie had always intended for him, and the leaving of him was hard for her in the way that the going of all things she had loved was hard for her, with the particular weight of someone who knows loss personally and at depth. But Tobias was there, steady and present, and he said what he had learned to say to her when she needed it, which was simply the truth. This is the kind of going that is actually an arrival. This is what you were working toward. Eli wrote letters, long and formal and increasingly thoughtful, and came home for the summer months with new ideas and new questions. And the kitchen table conversations in those years were lively and argumentative in the best way. All of them Eli and Clara, and eventually Samuel, who turned out to be a remarkably vocal child from approximately age 2, talking over each other about things that mattered. because Sadie had raised them in a house where things were talked about and considered and honestly examined, and Tobias had confirmed and continued this, and the household was the better for it. Clara, at 16, was already the kind of person that the county would one day describe as formidable, which was a word that her mother found satisfying. She had her mother's directness and her own particular warmth, and she had come through childhood with a clarity about what she valued and what she would not accept that had been forged in the specific crucible of having a mother like Sadie, which was to say a mother who showed her what it looked like to be brave and to be honest and to allow yourself to love people without pretending to be less than you were. Samuel, at 4 in 1890, was a small category of person unto himself, curious and cheerful and physically undaunted by anything, already following Tobias around the ranch in the way that Eli had done years earlier, with the serious intent of a child who has decided that this is the person from whom the important things are to be learned. In the fall of 1890, Sadie found herself pregnant again, and when she told Tobias this time, there was nothing of fear in it, only the full and open happiness of a person who is living a life she has entirely claimed as her own. This one was a girl. They named her Rose, for no reason except that the rose bush Sadie had planted near the porch 2 years earlier had come in thick and red that autumn, and the naming felt like the right kind of unreasonable thing, the kind that doesn't have to be justified because it is simply right. Rose Langston came into a house that was loud with love, full of the accumulated warmth of a family that had been built carefully and honestly over years, and she arrived into arms that were practiced and certain and glad. Sadie held her daughter on the night of her birth in the same room where she had held Samuel in the lamplight, and Tobias sat beside her as he had before, and the sound of the older children in the other rooms was a steady, comfortable music, and outside the Texas night was clear and cold and scattered with stars. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time I said it, that word, at supper?" He looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She smiled. "I said I loved the light in the evenings. And then I heard myself say it and I was terrified." "I know," he said. "You pretended you hadn't heard," she said. "You kept talking about the light on the pasture and I realized what you were doing and she shook her head slightly. "It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. It let me say it again on my own terms." "You would have found your way to it," he said. "You find your way to everything." "Eventually," she said, "but you made it possible to find it sooner." She looked down at Rose, at the small, determined face of her. "I have said that word a great many times since then. I intend to keep saying it." "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "I intend to keep deserving it." She looked up at him and her face was completely open and completely present. No distance, no fortress, no carefully managed surface, just her, Sadie Donnelly Langston, a woman who had survived the worst and come through it not diminished but larger, wider, more fully herself than she had known it was possible to be. "You already do," she said. "You have for a long time." He kissed her forehead and she leaned into him, and Rose slept between them, and the house held its warmth against the November cold, and outside the land of Texas went on in the dark as it always had, vast and patient, and threaded through with the lives of the people who had decided to make their stand on it, and in the small and particular world of the Donnelly Langston Ranch, which was not a famous place and would not be recorded in any history except the one that is made of ordinary days lived with full intention. In that small world, everything was exactly as it should be. They sat together until Rose stirred and Sadie nursed her, and the lamp burned low and then was turned down, and the night was quiet, and the morning would come with everything it always brought: work and weather and children and cattle, and all the thousand tasks that made up the fabric of a life, and they would meet it together, which was the thing that made all the difference, which was perhaps the thing that had always made all the difference, which was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of someone beside you in it, someone chosen and known and loved without reservation, and the word, that word that had been locked away for 3 years and had slipped out one ordinary evening evening at supper. That word was now simply part of the air of the house, breathing in and breathing out, present and permanent and entirely at home.